welcome to the What If We Think Differently podcast. My name is Nonsekelo Lonzula, and this is the Philanthropy series. So far, we have spoken about the definition of philanthropy, evolution of philanthropy, the difference between African philanthropy and global philanthropy, and now we've come to talk about the future of philanthropy. What does that look like? What does the potential of African philanthropy look like? Tendai, welcome.
Yeah, I'm getting warmed up for this discussion.
Are you hype? You ready?
Yeah, quite exciting. Looking forward to the feedback.
Let's jump right into it. What is the future of African philanthropy? What can we expect?
Yeah, but thank you so much for that. It's a very important question. We hope there's a future. But I think, honestly, I think it is one of the most dynamic spaces of thought, spaces of practice that we have currently on the continent. And the fact that it is not hung up on ideology, on whether right or left, but actually tries to be a space of compromise, it actually can be the place where we actually find each other on the continent, given the broad framing that we've done around African philanthropy.
Great. So now let's talk about the potential. So we've spoken about the possible future. What is the potential? Where can we go with it?
So I think African philanthropy has to be looked at from different perspectives, and I'll just clarify them. I think on the one hand, African philanthropy, at its barest minimum, it's about how we mobilize resources for Africans' development. And also, just to preface, African philanthropy can be seen as a paradigm of a way of doing things. Then African philanthropy can actually be seen even as a political project. So let me start off with the African philanthropy at its barest minimum around resources. What we have is a continent characterized, we always say that Africa is bulging in the middle, which is a great asset, by the way. It's not a problem. It's a good result. It's a good problem to have. What it means that Africa has the energy to accumulate, to produce, accumulate, and deploy resources. So our African youths are on the continent and they are there globally. And the African youths, for some reason, and this is the most exciting part, for some reason, African youths behave more or less like their counterparts globally. So when you're looking at how they deal with information and how they are public facing and how they are engaged with public issues, our African youths are potentially or probably the most engaged generation we've ever seen. So when you begin to think of it from a philanthropy perspective, and also studies have shown that they are prepared to give to causes. And we've also seen that they trust mobile technology platforms. So distance then does not matter. You don't have to meet them physically, but you have to make sure that you create the platforms for them to give. So on the one hand, just from an individual giving perspective, there is potential that if we're saying we've got 200 million youths, we are saying that we can raise $200 million.
It's a quick question. Does that analysis apply to youths that are not urbanized? Are they also forthcoming with giving? Can we also count them within that basket of people?
So African youths are the most migratory. So they move, the first level of migration is when they move from the rural into the urban. When the local urban does not work, they move maybe to the capital city. From the capital city, they may move into a sub-regional country, then all globally. So African youths cannot be seen from a single position. They move a lot. And but what we have seen is they are connected. Their connectedness to issues. They are not aloof. They engage, etc. So I don't want to overemphasize the youths as a source, because I also want to emphasize the growing middle class. Africa, since the turn of the century, probably as we began the second decade, 2013 thereabouts, we began to notice that Africa's middle class was growing. This is a middle class in dollar terms. This is a middle class either in terms of earnings or in terms of property. Yeah. So we begin to say this is a middle class that can actually begin to give. And many studies carried out by Trust Africa, by many others, have shown that this middle class actually gives to causes. It is driven by certain values, religion, loyalty to a place, etc., and certain passions. So that's the potential from a giving perspective, from a resource mobilization perspective. And also, the moment is exciting. Technology has made the world shrink. So we are able to show a challenge in real time, and people are able to respond in real time.
Yeah.
So the numbers make sense. The numbers are making sense. But thirdly, related to wealth, is the growth of African enterprises. 20, 30 years ago, we didn't have multinationals run by Africans. But now we've got quite a number of them. Pure multinationals emerging from places like Lagos, Nigeria, Harare, Zimbabwe, Pretoria, South Africa, but into the region, Pan-African in nature. So that means that we now have industries or corporations that are generating a scale a surplus at a scale unimagined before. And the fascinating thing is that they are also setting up foundations and they're giving. So in terms of the potential, we have the potential of mobilizing over $1 billion annually from the different sources I've made reference to support causes on the continent. So our challenge as we talk about the potential is how to organize ourselves, to organize people, organize money. That's the real issue that we face, to say we can see this potential, but it's all over. Who is organizing it? What institutions do we have in place? So that's the challenge of beginning to say, otherwise, see, potential is just that unrealized energy.
Yeah.
So it may end up being that if we do not take advantage. So it's an urgent task to say, how do we organize ourselves to really take advantage of the moment? Because it is a moment. And it can actually begin to feed on into the next part of the potential of African philanthropy as a paradigm. Because the challenge of Africa has not been that Africa did not have ideas for its development. There have been many other plans. There was the Lagos Plan of Action, I believe it was in 1984, a purely African-written, African-centered plan of transformation. But it did not get funding. No one funded it because it did not align with what the global north institutions were thinking of. But now we have the possibility of using resources that we have mobilized to begin to fund our own paradigm of development, right, where we begin to think differently, to say we are going to fund our development differently from what we've been doing or what they've been doing towards us. Because before this time, which is a golden moment, is we did not have the seat at the table. So it's just not about us having resources and being able to fund. It's also about African voices being on global tables, beginning to influence global discussions. So when you begin to look at important institutions and beginning to see Africans, it may look disconnected from the African philanthropy conversations. But now we know where our ideas can land, right, when we're pushing agendas. Mm-hmm. So I think just in terms of that ecosystem I've laid out, is to understand that, because African philanthropy can play a catalytic role, which is what we've always wanted it to be, because we appreciate that you cannot do development for a person or a community by themselves. What you can do is to make sure that they have the necessary ingredients for development. So we borrow again from what African cultures show us. If you look at in Nigeria at the Igbo artisanal scheme framework that they have, that if you are set up in the city, you are obligated to go and look for, not necessarily a nephew or a niece, but to look for somebody from the village, bring them to the city, let them work under you for 4 years, then you set them up for business. Mm. So when I look at the relationship between development of entrepreneurial activity, because that's what we have said, that Africa's path is to establish strong enterprises. If we use that Igbo approach, then we begin to say, how do we replicate this model beyond it being funded by Tendai or by one individual? But we actually create institutions that are founded on the principle of mentorship, training, then setting up for business.
I think you've actually just answered my next question, which was going to be around how can African philanthropy address issues of poverty, of inequality. In my head, I thought, okay, funding comes, it's now from Africans, sort out the poverty issue. But you're mentioning aspects that I hadn't really thought about. Could you just expand more on what you've just touched on?
Yeah, so I think, development has been made to be such a tough or difficult thing because of the catch-up mentality. And then we've made it look like we need big things, we need big enterprises, etc. So the Igbo framework, which I've studied extensively, helps. It really helps to set up, because when you talk to youths, those are trying to set up a business, their challenge is always what we call startup capital. No one has got. But the Igbos go further. It's just not about startup capital. It's about mentorship. Yeah, you spend 4 years observing, learning, and being taught. Yeah, so you are in a process that by the time you set up your own, you have seen the downfalls, you have seen the best practice, you have seen all the challenges, so it's easier. But if, like I said, if we replicate that at continental level, you can imagine, because our challenges, many of African enterprises hardly go beyond year number 5. They don't scale, they are not replicatable as models, etc. They are so centered around the entrepreneur. When the entrepreneur moves away or whatever, the enterprise dies. So Africa's challenge is to set up long-standing entrepreneurial organizations. That's one. Then number 2, we are the last bastion of smallholder agriculture globally, where there's the dominant practice. But we're here to figure out how to support this sector. So there are many opportunities that philanthropy can tap into, not just from a production perspective, but also value addition. When we begin to say, how do we make sure that the youths are added up, become part and parcel of the value chain? So we begin to see new technologies that are nimble, that can be moved to small places that do not need too much power. So we can begin to see rural manufacturing sites. So, because the reason why I say this, African philanthropy, by its very nature, has to take risks. By its very nature, is to be connected with where the people are. By its very nature, is to support the small person. Because that's how it positions itself differently from other forms of philanthropy that go on and support what exists, what is big, and what is relatable to them. So for us is to begin to say, let's go into those areas where it's actually a blue ocean in terms of there's not enough in terms of resources being deployed towards that. So if you go into smallholder communities, etc., you actually begin to realize that the studies have shown that for us who produce, when we produce coffee, cocoa, and many others, we are only participating maybe in terms of 10% of the global value chain in terms of how much we get from producing that. But yet we're the biggest producers. But it's because we're not playing in the area of value addition. We are not adding we're not packaging, we are not removing, we're not grinding, we're not making them into cigars if it's tobacco, we're not making our own coffee, we're exporting it in big barrels. So when we begin to go into those spaces, the only sector that can take a big bet and begin to say, let's take a big bet on rural communities and let's support them financially this way. For me, I think it's African philanthropy. Because we're talking of people who came from the village. In the majority of cases, it's very interesting if you spend time listening to the podcasts of high net worth individuals, and the majority spend time in the village. So they know village life. So it's not something that they are being taught to say the village is like this. So we're saying that based on their experiences, and we've seen it, they have a desire to take others out of poverty. Tony Elumelu of Nigeria has played a huge role in setting up this entrepreneurial fund where he's making sure that it's an Africa Enterprise Challenge Fund, where he makes sure that youths receive training, etc., and funding to start up. And it's a Pan-African initiative. So I think we cannot take that for granted and begin to say somebody will come and do it for us. We really need to embrace it and say, this is our challenge. These are the things that will help us go forward.
Right. So from what you've said, I'm gathering that the potential of African philanthropy is somewhat linked to entrepreneurship within Africa, as well as taking space within the agricultural sector. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah. Look, like I said, it's also the African philanthropy as a paradigm and its potential is to disrupt capitalism as we know it. Because capitalism it has made others prosper, but it has also left a lot behind. Many people have been left behind. But if you look at the founding philosophy of African philanthropy, is not about the allocation of a surplus, but it's actually about the production of value.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So African philanthropy does not wait until you have a lot of money to give away. African philanthropy is with you from the beginning. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So African philanthropy helps to set up a production-oriented collective action platform where you're pulling together assets, labor. If you are youths, you are being given resources to start your businesses and you move forward. So African philanthropy is not about the surplus, but it's actually about the creation of value. So if you look at that, it disrupts capitalism. It potentially then helps us or enables us to think about a more inclusive society, because it does away with inequality, because it tries to create opportunities for everyone. Which is what we've been struggling with, because other frameworks of development, especially the mainstream framework, it has winners and losers, and it picks winners at an early stage. And Africa has always been subordinated to being part of the source of resources, but as a loser in the equation. So for us to flip that equation, we need to look at African philanthropy as a paradigm of thought and practice, to begin to say, how do we reorganize our economies to make sure that from day one we're inclusive? So you even think of, do you need, if you're now taking this, embracing it as a development paradigm at a national level, maybe instead of thinking of the firm in the way we've been thinking about it as a for-profit, you begin to think maybe of a social enterprise. So in another piece, I talk about the sweet spot between African philanthropy and social entrepreneurship. Just when you begin to combine those from a values perspective, you actually begin to realize that perhaps that's the only way that Africa can actually contribute something significant in terms of disrupting the global pattern around accumulation.
Around capitalism.
Yes.
I see that. Now, what are the key areas where African philanthropy can make the most difference, in your opinion?
Yeah, African philanthropy for me, as a practice, as a way of distributing financial resources, has to think differently. Yeah, he has to find ways of saying, how do you work complementary to governments? Because I find that in many African countries, we've given up hope on governments. But government is always going to be the agency that is responsible for development. So, and philanthropy may have resources, but they're not enough. So for me, African philanthropy should play a catalytic role. And by catalytic, I'm saying by instigating new thought patterns, instigating new pilots to pilot an idea, to disrupt. If you're looking right now, one of the biggest problems we have in Africa is that of litter.
Very
everywhere. We have a big problem of litter. And I'm yet to see coherent philanthropic thought to say, how as a philanthropy space do we think about litter? But for me, when I look at it, is to say, if you look at litter, you are also seeing an opportunity for employment. You are seeing an opportunity to respond to climate change related problems. You are seeing an opportunity for increased productivity in agriculture and other sectors. You are seeing an opportunity for reuse of certain materials. But we have not really thought of it as an industry in many instances. So we have large-scale littering in Africa. Many African countries, our cities are dirty. And we have large-scale unemployment of our youths. Yeah, they're idling away. And yet, if African philanthropy was to be invested in the twin problem of resolving youth unemployment and cleaning up the cities, the reason why I'm saying that, it's a low-hanging fruit. It's taking litter and beginning to sort it out to say this is organic. It can be used and developed into organic manure. And that organic manure reduces the dependence of farming communities on synthetic fertilizers that are doing harm to the environment anyway. So we reduce even our carbon footprint. Then we use these organic manures to enhance productivity.
Right.
So you're killing many birds with just dealing with litter. So you're dealing with youth unemployment. Because our youths, Nancy, and this is one thing that we always have to remind people, that when we talk about African youths, we're not talking about illiterate youths. Our youths are so educated. I've come across youths with master's degrees and unemployed. So our youths, given opportunities, can shame us with the kind of innovations they can come up with. So if you go to the global north countries, the recycling industries is well advanced, is well developed. Ours is on the edges, because it's actually looking like, when you start talking about this, like you have lost hope.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And yet it's a place whereby there are benefits along the way that we have to think about. So if African philanthropy was to invest in that, create a new industry.
So there's a need for innovation.
Need for innovation, but also going to areas that others are not touching. My worry has always been when I see organizations trying to overcrowd a sector. They just find themselves focusing on one sector and not thinking through to say, but their catalytic role is that they can actually create new sectors or new subsectors of the economy, new value chains. That's the advantage of being in the space and being on the ground, to begin to say, you know what, we can't all be doing the same thing. Some of us need to move in a certain direction, different direction. So let me use, and this one may sound a bit controversial. In the majority of cases, the African high net worth foundations I've interacted with are invested in scholarships.
Right.
So we get our youths educated, and we applaud that. Like this is October. We're in September. In Zimbabwe alone, 25,000 graduated.
Yes.
I'll bet my dollar that only 5,000 or less will get jobs.
Get employment.
Yeah, but these are beneficiaries of scholarships from high net worth foundations, etc. So beyond access to education, what are we doing? So that's what we need to be thinking about, to say, have we really fixed the problem of youths when we're just getting them into school but not equipping them for life? Yes, they have a degree. And the idea,
what happens after?
Exactly. The idea of graduate unemployment is not unique to Zimbabwe. It cuts across many African countries.
Right.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to discuss this, but I think it's a very important issue around rethinking, reimagining, which is what we are doing here with this podcast, to say, yes, African philanthropy, yes, we are looking at, finances, we're looking at working together, but what does that look like in terms of thinking or reimagining the world in a different way?
Exactly.
Right? How does gathering resources look like if we look at it from a different aspect?
Exactly.
So Tendai, thank you so much for joining us. We are going to be going into our 5th episode. I am excited. This has been such an insightful discussion that we've had.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to the next one.
Me too. So thank you so much for joining us for this episode of What If We Think Differently on Philanthropy. We hope to see you again soon. Goodbye for now.
Thank you.